Hi, I've been looking everywhere for pennies and I just can't find any. I think they're somewhere in this hallway, but I'm not sure where. Aha! I knew they were around here somewhere. My penny collection. Let's take a closer look. As you can see, I have a large amount of pennies. And you might be saying, well, we don't really use pennies anymore, and it's true, you don't have to use them, and they're certainly not being produced anymore, but pennies still exist, including in this large container I have here. And what you can do is you can take them to the bank, and if you take them to the bank, they will exchange them for other coins, and then they'll melt them down, and you'll never see them again. So, that's why I don't take my pennies to the bank, because I like to keep them. Because I don't want them to be melted down because I care about them so much. But if you were to exchange them, you could take 10 of these and give them to the bank and they would give you a dime, right? So what I'm trying to think about is there a way, just like we can exchange pennies, is there a way that we can exchange hundredths for tenths? Let's take a look. We all know that if you have 1 penny, that's 1 cent. And if you were to keep adding pennies, it would be 2 cents, 3 cents, 4 cents, 5 cents, 6 cents, 7 cents, 8 cents, 9 cents. Now look what happens to the digits over here if I add one more penny. We have 9 cents over here, and the place value is showing the 9 in this section. Watch what happens if I add one more penny. It rolls over to 10 cents. You've traded a 9 for a 1 in a different place value. Now, let me ask you a question. Can you trade 10 pennies for a different coin? Yes, you can. You can trade it for a dime. So what I'm trying to think about is, can you do the same kind of trading when you're dealing with tenths and hundredths? Let's take a look. On the left we have 1/10, and on the right we have 1/100th. And as you can see when we're looking at this kind of grid, a tenth goes all the way across. It's like one long bar. So what happens if I break that tenth into hundredths? How many hundredths is 1/10? Let's find out. All I've done is change what the grid looks like. I haven't changed how much is colored in. I've broken the grid up into 100 pieces rather than 10, but as you can see the colored in piece is the same size and length. So, how many hundredths is 1/10? As you can see, there are 10 of them, so it's 10 hundredths. And the point that I'm trying to make here, if you take a look at the 10 hundredths at the top or the 1/10 at the bottom, is that 1/10 is the same as 10 hundredths when you write it as a decimal. In the tenths place, there's still a 1, and in the hundredths place, there's nothing over here and nothing over there. Over here, there's nothing because there's no digit at all, and over here there's nothing in the hundredths place because 0 means nothing. Sorry to break it to you, 0, you still mean nothing, go cry somewhere else. So 1/10, when you write it as a decimal, is the same as 10 hundredths when you write it as a decimal. The only difference is that the 10 hundredths has a 0. And you could say this in two ways. You could say it as 10 hundredths, or you could say it as 1/10 and 0 hundredths, because there's 1 in the tenths place and 0 in the hundredths place. How could we represent this fraction of a painting in two different ways as decimals? Well, we could count how many hundredths there are just by counting the individual pieces. And I know that there are 43 pieces, so I could write 0.43, and you could say that as 43 hundredths. But you could also think of it this way. Remember that an entire bar across is a tenth. So how many tenths are there? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 tenths. And then how many extra pieces? 1, 2, 3. And when we're looking at the decimal, we know, okay, this is the ones place, this is the tenths place. As I said, there are 4 tenths. And then how many extra pieces? 3. That's in the hundredths. So instead of saying 43 hundredths, you could say how many tenths there are, and then how many hundredths there are. So instead of 43 hundredths, you could say 4 tenths and 3 hundredths. And all we're doing is, instead of saying the entire number and putting it in the hundredths, we're saying the number of tenths and hundredths individually. I want you to try doing that with 4 of these fractions that come up. So I've given you 4 fractions. Number 1, write them as a decimal. Number 2, write them as hundredths. And number 3, write them as tenths and hundredths separately. So press pause to try it out, and then press play to check your answers. Okay, let's check if you got them right. Starting in the top left corner, it's 26 hundredths, and you could write that as 0.26. And of course you could say 26 hundredths like I just said, but you could also look at the 2 in the tenths place and say 2 tenths, and look at the 6 in the hundredths place and say 6 hundredths, so 2 tenths and 6 hundredths. Next fraction, 81 hundredths. You could write that as 0.81. And as I said, you could say that as 81 hundredths, but you could also look at the digit in the tenths place and the digit in the hundredths place and say, okay, 8 tenths and 1 hundredth. Here's the fraction in the bottom left, and it's 14 hundredths, and you could write that as 0.14, and you could say 14 hundredths, but you could also say it as 1 tenth and 4 hundredths. Why? Because there's a 1 in the tenths place and a 4 in the hundredths place. And finally, I switched the digits around for the last number here, 41 hundredths. You could write that as 0.41. Or you could just say 41 hundredths. Or you could look in the tenths place and see, oh, there's a 4 in the tenths place and a 1 in the hundredths place, so 4 tenths and 1 hundredth. What about this painting? Well, there's hardly any of this painting that you can see, so you know it's going to be a very small decimal indeed. I see there are 4 pieces, and the grid is broken up into 100 pieces, so that's 4 hundredths. You could write that as 0.04, and as I said, you could call that 4 hundredths. But remember, we can look at the individual place value. These are the ones, these are the tenths, these are the hundredths. So you could say how much is in the tenths and how much is in the hundredths. So you could say 0 tenths and 4 hundredths. Now you may think, well, that's kind of a waste of time because 0 means nothing, so 0 tenths and 4 hundredths is kind of redundant, and maybe that's true. But it's important to think of these decimals in terms of place value. So that's what we're going to do in our next example. I want you to write these as decimals, hundredths, and tenths plus hundredths. Press pause to try it out. Press play to check your answers. Okay, let's check your answers, folks. In the top left corner, we have 5 hundredths, and you could write that as 0.05. And you're making sure that you're putting the 5 in the hundredths place, not in the tenths place, because it's 5 hundredths, so the 5 goes in the hundredths place. And you could say that as 5 hundredths, as I just said. And you could also say 0 tenths and 5 hundredths. I don't know why you would do that, but we're going to do it anyways. In the top right corner, we have 7 hundredths, and you would write that as 0.07, not 0.7, because 0.7 would be 7 tenths. And this says 7 hundredths, and you know because there's a 100 at the bottom there. 7 hundredths. 7 needs to be in the hundredths place. As I said, it's 7 hundredths, and you could also call it 0 tenths and 7 hundredths. Let's look at the fraction in the bottom left. It's 1 over 100, so you could write that as 0.01, not 0.1. This is 1 hundredth, not 1 tenth. And you could also write it as 0 tenths and 1 hundredth. And finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have 2 hundredths, and you write that as 0.02. Or you could say 2 hundredths, or you could say 0 tenths and 2 hundredths. And finally, in this beautiful piece of art here, you can see that there are only horizontal bars, right? Horizontal bar, horizontal bar, horizontal bar, horizontal bar. Any extra pieces? No. So how would we write that? Well, we could count the individual pieces and say there are 40 hundredths. And it's true. If we counted these, we would see there are 40 of them. But remember, this is the ones place, so this is the tenths place, and this is the hundredths place. So we could also say, oh, in the tenths place, there are 4. And we know there are 4 tenths because we know that a horizontal bar is a tenth, and we know there are 1, 2, 3, 4 horizontal bars. So we know from the picture and from the place value that we could also say there are 4 tenths and 0 hundredths. So in the next set of fractions, you're going to be looking at situations where there are no extra hundredth pieces, only tenths, so you can write it as tenths or as hundredths, like this. Write these as decimals, hundredths, and as tenths plus hundredths. Press pause to try it out. Press play to check your answers. Starting in the top left, you've got 60 over 100, and you could write that as 0.60. And how would you say that? Well, you could say 60 hundredths, which is what it looks like in the fraction, or you could look at the place value on the decimal and say, well, there's a 6 in the tenths place, so 6 tenths and 0 hundredths. Next fraction in the top right, 70 over 100, you could write that as 0.70. And you could say 70 hundredths. Or you could look in the tenths place and say, oh, there's a 7 in the tenths place, so 7 tenths and 0 hundredths. In the bottom left corner, we have 80 over 100, and you could write that as 0.80. Or you could say, well, that's 80 over 100, so it's 80 hundredths. Or you could look in the tenths place and say, oh, that's an 8 in the tenths place, so 8 tenths and 0 hundredths. And finally, in the bottom right corner, we have 30 over 100, and you could write that as 0.30 and say, well, that's 30 hundredths. But you could also look in the tenths place and say, there's a 3 in the tenths place, 3 tenths, 0 hundredths. And that's how you can trade your tenths for hundredths. So just like I can exchange 10 pennies for a dime, I can exchange 10 hundredths for a tenth. And now that you know that, I want you to complete page 224 in your Jump Math book, and then the quiz that happens after that. And I'm going to count my pennies to see how much money I have. Probably not so much, because it's not really worth much anymore. But it's something for me to do in the meantime.